thanking and praising God for, among other things, just the chance to see another day, but maybe even above that for his mercy. Understanding that we are now in Luke chapter 23, a chapter that describes the trial or the continuation of the hearing that Christ was going to get, one that led to him not actually receiving mercy. And it is actually in some ways the denial of mercy to him that provides that portion of mercy that God is willing to extend to us, that Paul will later describe as an opportunity at reconciliation with God in a way that would not be possible without the sacrifice of the Christ that we will see here in, as we mentioned, Luke chapter 23, a chapter that I would like to look at through the lens of the title misleading, understanding that that term is going to come up literally in verse 2 in a chapter that begins in verse 1. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." As that section of verses will give us the first of 3 times that we will see Pilate saying that he finds no guilt in Christ. But that first section in which he says it in verse 4 is going to lead into him sending Christ over to Herod, because during the course of the allegations, he's going to talk about the way that he has stirred up Galilee, Galilee being under the jurisdiction of Herod, someone that at this point Pilate does not seem to be all that fond of. Is going to still give him the opportunity to kind of move this on to Herod, and that is what he's going to do. However, in verses 6 through 17, really, the ESV literally going through 16 with a footnote for verse 17, that has a verse in some manuscripts. It's not in all of them, but it's one that correlates to what we've seen in the previous descriptions of the crucifixion in at least Matthew, possibly, as I say from time to time, Matthew and Mark, that portion saying that he was accustomed to releasing a prisoner to them. But before he gets there, he is in verse 15 going to say that once again, not only did he find nothing deserving of death done by the Christ, but likewise Herod, even though he mocked Jesus and didn't treat him especially well, he didn't find a legitimate cause for guilt in him either. And so then he is going to go on in verses 18 through, roughly 25 to break the news to them. They're not going to receive it well. But once again, not only is he going to say he finds no guilt in them, he's going to say, "Why are you so upset?" My paraphrase for what he's literally going to say in verse 22, "Why, what evil has he done?" Understanding that they have now called for him to be crucified, even though there was no cause for him to be brought before Pilate or Herod, as far as they were concerned, at all. It's a little bit extreme to go from, obviously, a situation where he's not guilty of anything, then for them to ask for the death penalty. But as it said from time to time, that's what it was. Understanding that verses 26 on through, roughly 43, are then going to describe his crucifixion as basically it's going to remind us of the way that his presence or his ministry, as he said, he did not come to bring peace, but a sword that would bring a line of division in Israel. And likewise, his crucifixion is going to bring that kind of division, as we saw. However, one additional description that I think Luke adds that I didn't see, at least notice as significantly in the previous Gospels, was the way in which the daughters of Jerusalem, or those who followed him, especially the women who followed him, are weeping for him. And he is going to say in verse 28, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children," as he is going to go on to describe what it's going to look like in Jerusalem after God has lifted his hand of protection from over the city. Understanding, once again, it's my paraphrase for it, but again, that's another description of the decline of the nation heading into, once again, AD 70, the day or the date of the fall of Jerusalem. Understanding that, he's then going to go on in verses 32 through 38 to describe how 2 other criminals were crucified with him. But that portion of the crowd that is actually finding joy in his injustice is going to include, in verse 35, the rulers who scoffed at him, the soldiers in verse 36 who mocked him, and one of those criminals in verse 39 who railed against him. However, the division is going to be seen in Luke's description of the way in which the other criminal crucified with him is going to basically try to put a stop to the railing of the one criminal, saying, "Don't you have any shame whatsoever?" Once again, my paraphrase. But it's literally going to say in verse 40, but the other rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. A phrase that became popular a few years ago, quite possibly from this statement in the Bible. But it's rare in our lives that we can literally say that we have done nothing wrong, especially to the degree that this could be applied to the Christ who literally never did anything wrong. Even if in certain circumstances we are actually innocent, that's a blessing. But oftentimes that phrase, I'm glad it's not used all that much anymore as it applies to us, because often it's used to or it's stretched into situations where we might have some proportion of responsibility in a situation where we just don't want to take any at all. Christ, however, as the word says, let another praise you, not the words coming out of your own lips. He, had the thief on the cross, actually accurately realized that he was actually innocent, leading into the famous exchange where he asks Christ, meaning the thief on the cross, or the criminal on the cross, asks Christ to remember him when he comes into his kingdom, at which point Christ is going to famously say in verse 43, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. As the next set of verses, verses 44 through 49, are going to describe the way in which darkness falls over the land, at which point he is going to breathe his last, helping us to see, in addition to the differentiation we see between those who found joy in his crucifixion and the one thief on the cross who spoke up reasonably on his behalf. We're going to see that continue, because one of the centurions, part of the group who was responsible for actually killing him, is likewise going to stand up and say this man was innocent in verse 47. In addition, in verses, I think it's 40, verse 48, the crowds, as we mentioned in a previous lesson, some of them are going to turn and walk away in shame, possibly representing some contrition, maybe some of the contrition that was available by the time we get to Acts 2, when we see Peter preaching on the day of Pentecost, converting many of those who were actually guilty of participating, or at least consenting to the death of the Christ, understanding that his sermon provoked the famous statement, men and brethren, what shall we do? When he basically said that that Christ who they crucified, God has made him Lord and Savior. But with that, they are not alone, because, of course, he was followed by those who loved him and could be considered his disciples. Verse 49 saying, and all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things. And they weren't the only ones, because as Luke likewise describes his burial, similar to the way we will see, or we have seen in Matthew and Mark, we're going to see that another individual, Joseph of Arimathea, was actually a member of the council who refused to consent to the death of the Christ. But as we've mentioned before, his opposition was not enough to prevent it from happening. However, apparently not giving up on at least trying to do what was right. Another version is going to say that he found the courage to go ask for Christ's body, and he was granted that privilege, at which point he is going to begin the process of burying the Christ, something that is going to be continued on in the next chapter, understanding that they're coming up on the Sabbath day, and so they're going to initiate the burial process, with the ladies hoping to complete his burial process by adding spices to the body, worrying, however, who they will get to roll away the stone from the tomb. However, in the relatively famous account that once again will be continued in chapter 24, that won't be an issue, because in Luke's description, they will be met by two men, quite possibly two angels, who are going to let them know that he is risen. However, the part that caught my attention most about this chapter, at least at this point, was that whole concept of Jesus misleading the people, the accusation that started off the chapter, that served as the basis for them asking Pilate to crucify him, understanding that if you see the things that Jesus did, if you're a believer especially, and you understand all the great things that he did leading up to the triumphal entry, then you realize that he was not misleading the people, he was actually leading the people. However, the foundation for the accusation that he was misleading the people came from those who had, as we sometimes say, a teacher who warned us about, as we talked about a couple weeks back, making yourself the hero of your own story. And so they provide now a very famous example of those who had centered themselves in Israel. And because of that, anything that Jesus did, no matter how right it was never going to be enough if It wasn't affirming them as the heroes of Israel's story, reminding me of something that the prophet Isaiah wrote around about chapter 5, or exactly in chapter 5, beginning in verse 20, where it reads, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight." A passage which actually reminds me of something that I think I heard out of a non-believer, or somebody who doesn't necessarily identify as a Christian, who seem to say that we are living, or we seem to be living in times where left is right and up is down. That's not literally the way they said it, but it is literally the sentiment that they were communicating, understanding that whatever truth was, it's just kind of flipped now. And similar to what we have seen out of the chief priests, scribes, etc., in the trial of the Christ, it now seems to turn around the preferences of anyone who can grab control of the narrative. But as the previous gospels have likewise shown us, controlling the narrative is temporary in a world where God still controls outcomes. And in many ways, that's the lesson in the resurrection that we'll see in the next chapter. Reminding me of something I saw on social media just today that says, you don't always have to tell your side of the story. Time will. I like that because it reminds me of why Jesus might have been so quiet at his own trial, understanding that his Father was about to correct the allegation that he was misleading the people, which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. May God give us a spirit to speak when it's appropriate, but to also be at peace and be silent in times when he is ready to correct the wrongs that we endure.